So, I'm Richard Balls, and I'm the author of A Furious Devotion, and it's the biography of Shane MacGowan, and it's out on Omnibus Press on the 7th of October. So the book is a very extensive biography of Shane, and it's very much the whole story of his life, right from his childhood through his career as a musician and a songwriter, and then on through to the current day. So picking up his recent marriage and great successes and recognition that he's had in recent years with the Ivor Novello Award and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Concert Hall as well. The book was written with Shane's cooperation and also that of his wife Victoria and his sister Siobhan and his father Maurice. The interviews were conducted in his own flat in Dublin. When I say interviews, these are not interviews in the way that we might normally understand that word. I had the advantage of sitting in his living room with him, watching television, having a drink for hours, days at a time, and obviously that gave an insight that was incredibly privileged, but also I think very insightful and very revealing in terms of the kind of person that he actually is off stage, the kind of person that most fans have never seen really. The interviews were done with other people, more than 60 people in total, and that included a lot of people who'd never spoken before. It's quite interesting that a lot of members of Shane's family, even, particularly on his father's side, had never really been interviewed about Shane before, but obviously had a lot of quite interesting things to say about him. His teacher, Tom Simpson, now the late Tom Simpson, from Homewood House School, he had kept Shane's school books and essays all this time, right up to the age of kind of 90. And I think that tells you something incredibly revealing about how gifted Shane was at an incredibly early age. And again, he had never spoken before about Shane, and again, talking to him and seeing what Shane had actually written when he was 8, 9, 10 years old, and hearing about the kind of literary subjects that he was kind of devouring as a small child, tells us, I think, a great deal about Shane's writing and where that was rooted, really. Lots of other names that people will be really familiar with, so Finbar Fury, Sharon Shannon, Sinead O'Connor, lots of musicians who hold Shane in very, very high esteem, also wanted to speak about him. I didn't find it difficult to persuade people to talk about Shane. There were one or two people who didn't want to take part in the book, but that's normal with any biography of this kind. But in the most part, people were incredibly generous with their time and really wanted to talk about Shane and why they love him. And I have to say that having spent a lot of time with him, I've become incredibly fond of him myself. One of the things I think that will surprise people more than anything about Shane when they read the book is about his childhood and his upbringing, where he was born, the kind of life that he had. And a lot of people have assumed and in fact been told in different documentaries and articles in newspapers that Shane was actually born in Ireland. Whereas he wasn't. He was born in Pembury Hospital in Kent, near Tunbridge Wells. So A Furious Devotion looks in great depth at Shane's young life, and I make no apology for that, because it's as is true with a lot of us, what happens in our early years informs the people that we become, and I think in Shane's case that is certainly true. So growing up in Tunbridge Wells, Shane and his sister Siobhan and his parents were living in a very middle-class suburb, the kind of place where people clean their cars on a Sunday morning, very English town. And it was to the Commons in Tipperary that he went on holidays with the family. And the Commons now, and certainly at the time as well, would have been like a completely different world for a child who was growing up in an English suburb, because the Commons was like, sort of stepping back in time 200 years a very, very old island. And that's something that Shane particularly became kind of obsessed with, really. Old Ireland, the music of Old Ireland, the values of people living in rural parts of the country. Very, very different from, it wasn't the parts of Dublin that Shane was influenced by in terms of his music. I've got a contemporary Dublin. It was Old Ireland, the music of that his aunts and uncles had really steeped him in when he went to the Commons, this kind of ramshack cottage in the middle of nowhere. It was there that his imagination was fired with the stories that he heard his aunts and uncles telling about the family's links with Irish history, with the Republican movement, the music that he heard being played and saw being played in the kitchen, people dancing at the crossroads in the village. And this really fired his imagination massively. And we can see that in some of the lyrics to songs like The Broad Majestic Shannon. And Pogues fans, when they read this book, and they start looking at his life in ways that they'll have never been told before. I mean, this is new information, a lot of this. But also for Shane, in terms of his perception of the world, I think at that time, when he was very young, there was a kind of disconnect, because here he is being brought up. He was, on a Saturday night, he'd sit with his sister and they'd watch Doctor Who and they'd watch all the favourite programmes in England, and they were going to English schools and all the rest of it. But yet, the life that he really yearned to be living all the time was the life that he saw on holiday at the Commons with his aunts and uncles, and helping out on the farm, listening to the music. And everyone would have to, when he was small, him and Siobhan would have to take a turn. Everybody took a turn to play an instrument or stand up. And so Shane, when he was 2 or 3, would stand up on the table in the Commons and do a turn and sing a song. So there was a kind of disconnect there. And I think this is something that a lot of Irish people, second generation Irish people being brought up in the UK, have always felt, as a kind of, not really being Irish, because not being born in Ireland and not living in Ireland, growing up there, but not really English either, because they've been brought up in an Irish family, Catholic family, and going back to this other world, which let's face it, it really was, and it in fact still is, really, when you go to the Commons, which I've been fortunate enough to do. So there was, I think, a kind of, not a crisis of identity, but certainly a search for his real identity going on. Here it is. This is A Furious Devotion, The Life of Shane MacGowan, and it's out on Omnibus Press on the 7th of October.